Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our conversation series on race and gender here at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. My name is Sungyeon Choi Moro. I'm the executive director at NAPOF, where we have been hosting a series of conversations over the month of now into June, discussing different aspects our lived experiences in the intersection of race and gender here in the United States as Asian American Pacific Islanders. Today, I have the amazing honor and privilege of having a conversation with a number of fantastic writers who have written in various formats and telling various stories. The idea for this panel really stemmed from the aftermath of the Atlanta spa shootings, where there was a huge presence online from storytellers and how Asian American Pacific Islander writers were connecting their experiences, what they're writing about in the intersection sexism comes through in their storytelling. And a lot of the writers and what they're saying at the time reached many and touched many people. I know I personally have read a lot that really resonated with me and was in part of, my healing journey as well as we were all, coming to reckoning with what happened in Georgia. Many of us were outraged, and because this is what writers have always been saying about what happens when people continue to be racist and sexist towards Asian American Pacific Islander um, people, especially women and girls. And so we were introduced to the Asian Writers Workshop, AAWW, and decided to collaborate on today's forum, today's conversation. And we present a conversation on the importance of radical storytelling with a panel of speakers who are redefining what Asian diasporic literature looks like today. It will feature AAWW Executive Director Jeffrey Nudin, Booker Prize nominated Sipam Zhang, novelist and editor Megha Majumdar, and poet and cultural organizer Rasha Abdulhadi, and author Kristiana Kahakauwila. Sorry, I'm really sorry about that. And let me say that again. Kristiana Kahakauwila. Our storytellers will speak to working across all aspects of literary industry, pushing boundaries as editors, writers, and activists, and disrupting traditional American literary narratives. Some of you may read their work, and so we're really excited to have this panel today. And so I'm going to ask the panelists themselves, because often it's fun to hear folks as how they want to enter a space and be introduced. So I'm going to turn it over first to Jeffreen, who is the executive director of AAWW, to kick us off. And then if we could just go around and do introductions, that would be really fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sungyeon, and thanks everybody at NAPOF for hosting this conversation. We're really excited to collaborate with you. Thank you to all the other panelists. It's just a real joy to be in conversation with friends and peers. My name is Dean. I'm the executive director of the Asian American Writers Workshop. I was appointed in this role last year, and I'm the first woman to hold the role in the organization's 30-year history. I'll just give a little bit of background info actually about the workshop in case you all are not familiar with it. The Asian American Writers Workshop is a national literary nonprofit dedicated to amplifying Asian and Asian diasporic storytelling. We host public programs. We have an award-winning digital magazine called The Margins, where we publish new work. And we have fellowship programs to support emerging writers in both working on across genres. So yeah, it's a real thrill to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
My name is Kristiana Kahakauwila, and I am a professor at University of Hawaii at Manoa on the island of Oahu. My family is from Maui. I am also descended from folks from Norway and from Germany. So I identify as hapa, loosely translates to mixed race, though there's an element of less than in the Hawaiian language. So a lot of my work is exploring what it means to be hapa in a full and as much as more than sense. And I also teach at the Institute of American Indian Arts.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Si Pam Zhang. My pronouns are she, her. I was born in Beijing, but call myself an artifact of the United States, having immigrated here at a very early age. One of the prizes I'm most excited to have been noticed by for my debut novel, How Much of These Hills is Gold, was the Asian Pacific Award for Literature. I'm just so excited to be part of this moment when so many voices across the diaspora are speaking out. Oh, hi, Vega. Thank you for holding up my book. Yeah, I'm just really interested in the different kinds of stories that our communities are starting to tell, really diverse stories that straddle genres, straddle different genders, straddle different ethnicities and cultures. I am really interested in how we make myths as a culture or as a splintered collective of cultures.
For being here. Thank you.
I can go. Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you, Pam and Kristiana. So nice to meet you, Sangyeon, Jeffrey, and Rasha. I'm a writer. I wrote a novel called Burning, which came out last year, and it's out in paperback soon. I grew up in India in a big city called Kolkata, and my work so far has been set in India, looking at how people pursue meaningful lives in the context of the rise of extreme nationalism. And I also work as an editor. I work at a small press called Catapult, where I acquire literary fiction and nonfiction. A lot of my list is writers of color. And I'm very excited about creating intellectual and artistic space for such writers to pursue what they are excited about. And I'm really happy to be here.
Hi, folks. My name is Rasha Abdulhadi. I'm going to give a brief visual description. I am a genderqueer Palestinian person with tortoiseshell cat's eye glasses, and I'm wearing a rainbow and black kufiya and a t-shirt that says Arabs for Black Power. In the background, you'll see a sign that says For Gaza and Free Palestine. As a queer Palestinian Southerner, I've spent nearly 20 years working in and across communities for environmental, racial, and economic justice. And as a poet, as an editor, as a speculative writer, as an arts administrator, as a fiber artist, as a community technologist, and as a cultural organizer, I have shaped my work in ways that we remember, bridge, and remake our relationships to each other. Affiliation-wise, I'm currently a senior fiction editor at Strange Horizons, which is a global speculative fiction magazine. Also publishes poetry, nonfiction reviews, and more. It is free to read, and authors get paid, so send us your work if you are writing in speculative genres. And I am currently published by Neon Hemlock Press. My current chapbook, Who is Ode Springtime, is available through them. Lovely anthologies and other chapbooks by wonderful writers. And I am a member of DC Justice for Muslims Collective, as well as Alternate Roots and the Radius of Arab American Writers. And I'm delighted to be here, especially as a Palestinian writer and organizer, and to really expand and as a genderqueer person to really embrace a range of how we have these internal conversations about who we include in our community and who we want to offer care to, about interrupting or dismantling the structural conditions that make racist violence possible and even sanctioned against so many of our communities, and to make community with other folks beyond who we work closely with. So I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you all of you for that introduction and just being part of this conversation today. So we're just going to dive right in because we really are here to hear from you. And just as a kickoff, want to hear a little bit about your journey, how you've tell us little bit about your story of becoming a writer, or poet, or an editor, or activist, who you see yourself in the space and offering up, especially in form of words, right, to our community and to the world. What prompted and what drives you to continue writing? We can have anybody jump in, or you can take a minute to think.
I mean, I can
get us started.
Go for it.
Sorry, I feel like I interrupted someone. Oh, thank you, Rasha. So I think I got really serious about writing. I've been writing for a long time, like I think many writers do, but I got really serious about it and I stopped seeing myself as a tinkerer when I started seriously observing what was happening in India with the rise of Hindu nationalism, and feeling that I had questions about it that needed the scale of a novel. So that's when I started working on this book. And what drives me to continue writing is, I think there is such meaning in bringing complex stories to the page. That is always part of my aspiration, is how do we tell our specific stories in all of their complexity without flattening anything, without simplifying anything? How do we bring these truths to bear on the page? And at the same time, as writers, so many of the craft questions that we think about, I think are also political, because they are about how do we invite readers into the complexity of the questions that we want to ask.
I can follow. I think, like many writers, and Mega, you gesture towards this, have been writing for a long time. I've been writing since I was at least 8. Experience of relationship to art is one of survival and also one of family experience. I never experienced art as something separate from daily life. People in my family made visual art, made music, sang songs, and stories as a small child were welcomed as part of our family life. And I think that definitely informs still my relation to art creation. I don't as something, well, I think the business of it and the professional field of it is valuable. I don't think of it as something separate from what keeps us alive as people, what helps us locate tools for survival for ourselves, how do we come to terms with our own experiences and understandings, and how do we ourselves in time and in history, in geography, in economy, and in structures of power. And I feel really aware of wanting my writing to be multivalent, to be map making, to be a herbalist cookbook, to be a first aid kit, to be a pattern book for glamorous costumes, to be a song book for family gatherings, or to be those soft whispered words used in seduction between lovers. And I think all of that writing, I think, to me, and we have ample demonstration in both literal and poetic ways in the last several years in which we can become breathing itself as a very deeply political act. Who gets to breathe? Whose breath is suppressed by the police state? Whose breath is abandoned to a catastrophic global health crisis? And so once I breathe, then what do I say with that breath? That is political. And it is political because if we are silent, we maintain these orders of the orderly, calm operation of these death-making institutions. And to speak is to exist upon our existence and to fight for the people that we love.
That really resonates with me, Rasha. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I think that I've always written because I love the sound of words. I love the sound of language, but I don't think that my writing, frankly, got very good or very specific to me until my writing got selfish. And what I mean by that is for such a long time, the majority of my life, I was reading and therefore writing works that were centered on a largely white, largely male, largely heteronormative, largely upper middle class experience. And that's what I thought writing was. And so all the way up until my early 20s, I was writing works that were sentence beautiful, that had beautiful metaphors and language, but were really vacuous and empty. I was writing suburban white people stories about like wealthy-ish white people going to dinner parties where in my head, I imagined that the main character might be Asian American like me because I didn't describe them, and tricking myself, right? That by not doing that kind of description, you know, I was creating a potentially sort of like multicultural world. And it really wasn't until I had this formative experience in my early 20s, a couple of things happened. My father died, and I had this really weird acid trip where in the moment of ego death, I was looking around at the people I was with, and I actually thought I was them, and they were all white, all blonde, and all blue-eyed. And I was like, this is not okay. And those two things really changed my writing forever. And I'm so interested now in just like writing from the visceral experience of the body, kind of sort of what Rasha said. What does it mean to live in a body that is fetishized? That is marginalized, in a body that feels these things, that gets put in these situations. What does that feel like? What does that look like? And I'm like really, like, as much as I believe that the personal is political and it's so wonderful to have this diversity of voices, I really don't want young writers, especially fiction writers, to necessarily walk into the space thinking, I have to make a statement. What is my message? What is my theme? Because I do think that the strongest message you can create is the one that is deepest within you, from a voice that is often repressed by the society that we live in, right? Write selfishly, write what you're interested in, and that will naturally make a statement. And that is naturally something that we all very much need to hear.
Yes, thank you to Mega and Pam and Rasha, because I am just agreeing with all of this. And I think for me, you know, the writing selfishly, where my writing like really took off is when I started understanding how much of my writing was me asking questions, the questions that were going on inside and were finally coming on the page. And a lot of that had to do with mapping, going back to what Rasha was saying, that I grew up in Southern California. My dad's side of the family is pretty much all on Maui, or at least in Hawaii. We came back a lot when I was a kid to Hawaii. I live here now. I decided to move back as an adult and be here on my own terms, so to speak. And so always I felt I was on one shoreline looking at the other shoreline. And when I finally rooted into that and understood that that was something I had to write about, it was a question of my existence and also of my family and also of my ancestors and also of immigration and also of indigeneity, that then I sort of just burst forth with this book, which is a collection of stories titled This is Paradise. It takes place in Hawaii. And that it was something that was so, you know, it was so deep inside of me, waiting to come out. And yet I can look back and see these moments from my undergraduate education. Say I was a comparative literature major and was very focused on France and French colonialism, particularly in North Africa. And I actually had to understand French colonialism to even see American colonialism, you know, in my own home. So it was like I had to go outside in some ways to understand what was going on inside.
Thank you all for sharing. It's so interesting. There's themes and then there's specificity. Just really, it's beautiful and it's really inspiring. So I ask is how you see your identity, and here the frame we've been using is race and gender, but frankly, that's not the only way we experience life, right? There's immigration status, place of origin, your religion, whatever identities that you bring with you that factor into your writing. How do you see that factoring into your writing? And I think, and some of you mentioned this a little bit in the previous answer, but what I'm really actually interested in is how do you hope readers would connect with your identity through your writing? I'm an avid reader. I mean, I've read, love to read people, especially US based authors of color. And so I'm always curious. I'm like, is this what they wanted me to feel when they wrote this? And so it's like a very personal, curious question, but just wanting to know like what the writers are thinking when they write. Maybe that's not what they're thinking at all, but just want to hear a little bit of what's going on in your head when you're writing and speaking to these nuances and the experiences and intersectionality, and how you hope readers would connect.
So, as the non-writer on the panel, as somebody who kind of supports and works with storytellers and writers every day, our organization's name has the word Asian American. So we think about and kind of contend every day with what that means as an identity. For us, we operate from a place of radical inclusivity, and that's rooted in the history of the term and the fight for it to even become a term, of the power of a really broad pan-Asian coalition. But I think what that means also is that there's no one Asian American representative identity, right? Like there's no one story that represents the Asian American experience. It's a diverse array, and I think it's reflective of how diverse that community is in its entirety. So for us, at least at the workshop, what we often think about is how are we enabling our storytellers to tell the stories that are truest and most authentic and most honest for them. Like Pam mentioned, what are we doing to help writers write as selfishly as possible? And I think as was kind of mentioned before, when that happens, that connection with the readers is, it's automatic, right? If you're writing something that means something to you, inevitably it will also mean something to someone else.
Yeah, just underlining everything Jeffreen said about the coalition and how we must always question what Asian American even means and understand the sort of history within this country of that term. For me, again, like my first audience is always myself because I need to write to please and surprise and delight myself. But then I think of sort of ever larger circles of audience, and the smallest, closest ones are the ones I care most about. So for example, my novel, How Much of These Hills is Gold, is this mythologized story of Chinese immigrants, and I decided to use unitalicized, untranslated Mandarin in the text, just sort of pidgin Mandarin that the family sort of intersperses throughout their English, as my family did growing up. And so to me, I got like a tickle of delight getting that on the page because that was a sort of syntax and rhythm and poetry I had never seen, and I wanted that. And then hearing readers respond, the ones that always like hit closest to home are Asian Americans, usually Asian American women or non-binary people who are like, I heard this growing up, I got that in that one scene where, the mother character says this full sentence in Mandarin. I understood that, and I understood the book on like a slightly deeper level than others. And that's wonderful to me. And then for, the outermost circle of say like, Americans who only have English as their language or only have English and non-Mandarin languages as their language, it's a slightly different relationship with the book, but I expect that, and I think that's actually delightful. And sometimes, I think that just speaks to like what I like about living in a multicultural country and a multicultural global world. It's like the analogy I sometimes draw is, you know, you want to be almost like mystified and enticed and seduced by other people's lives. And often what does that enticing and seducing is the mystery of them, the idea that there are like doors that you can kind of peek through, but you can't quite see behind. Like, I don't know, I lived in San Francisco for many years, and I have very poor Spanish gained through 2 years in high school. And it was delightful to me always to go into like the local taqueria and hear people speaking Spanish to each other, out of which I got a few words and I could sort of read maybe the gist of the conversation through the facial expressions, through the gestures. But I love that idea that we're walking through a world in which we hear bits of other people's stories. And sometimes we get all of it, sometimes we get 95% of it with a sort of like mysterious teaser on the end, and sometimes not all those stories are written or intended for us. But isn't that what you want out of life, is to like feel this mystery and wonder and delight around you? I don't know if I answered your question at all.
That was great. Imagery of the layers of audience, and yeah, no, it's literally like giving me a peek into a writer's brain. It's great. Anyone else?
I was going to say,
Oh, you go, Kristiana.
okay, thanks, Mega. I was just going to say that I actually had, when I saw the questions ahead of time, I struggled so much with the one, how would I want the readers to sort of connect to my identity? Because I think for me and my first book and the projects I'm working on now, so much is more wishing the reader to actually fall in love with the people I love. And so even though it's fiction, I want them to understand that these Hawaiian men, much like my uncle and dad, are so funny, and I want them to understand that these women, like my aunts and grandmother, are so tough. And so I think that, and my cousins, et cetera, and so, and this place, this Aina, this land, like this, I want folks to understand that it is not, what's advertised in tourist brochures, and it's something else. And so I'm actually much less interested, and maybe even very nervous. I'm terrible with social media. I'm very nervous about my own identity being connected to, or perhaps being, seen in any obvious way. And yet, I want my love for these people in this place to be the connecting thread. And I also appreciate the idea of delight. I think and write so much about delight. Raske's Book of Delights is, always here next to me. And I think that that's some of it too, is I want folks to be able to revel in delight, even as like, I'm tired of the exoticization, I'm tired of the fantasy. And so I want that realness, that complexity, that feeling that you're not getting that last 5%. It's actually not for you, but that's some of what is worth delighting in. So I think that's more where maybe I'm thinking about identity, is also, shying away from having me in there.
I can say that I hope that readers will find some kind of home or companionship in my work. Think about my relationship to all the things that I read as a young person, and the ways in which I was able to make sense of my own life through the writings of others, particularly as a young Palestinian proto-queer child growing up in rural South Georgia. The work of Black writers in the US was really the first time that I encountered something that helped me make sense of my own life experience and how I could feel deeply in a space and also constantly challenged about whether I belonged and who I belonged to and whether I fit. I think about I want my writing to give language to Palestinian experience and to contribute to the creation of liberatory languages of Palestinian freedom. And I feel particularly aware of it at this time. Maya Abu al-Hayat is been translated by Fadi Judah. She's a living Palestinian poet living in Palestine, writing in Arabic. And in one of her poems, she says, mention Palestine 20 times in a sentence. And I think about that a lot these days. And I think about it not Palestine, but for the ways in which Palestinian liberation and liberatory writing and art and life teachings, as the poet Rafif Ziada says, we teach life. How can writing be a part of this body of liberatory discovery, like discovering ourselves, discovering communities and the pathways to liberation that we can make together? In the same way that other authors from many different communities and life experiences have been part of that for me. I usually tend to write a longer bio. I don't think I'll ever be one of those authors that writes like a one-sentence biography. I think there are some times where it is useful, but I really want to say who I come from and who I belong to. I'll say, I sometimes struggle to provide delight or humor in my writing, although it appears, but my writing tends to be pretty, and often is intentionally either self-implicating or implicating of the reader. I really want to write writing in this time. I want writing that isn't just an entertainment that sort of exercises our emotions and then relieves the tension without giving us any pathway for transformative action or transformative relationship building, which I think is a different kind of action, a way of relating to people. I'm very aware of not wanting to commodify myself as some tasty morsel, even for an anti-racist, buffet. I think I really want my work to be accountable to internal community conversations first, and it from there. And in the end, I hope it keeps people good company on whatever their journeys or struggles or meal prep is.
Wi-Fi cut out, so I missed a little bit. But are we still on the question about identity and
Yeah, we are. Yes, I was hoping you could come back before we moved on. So welcome back.
Thanks, Sanyan. The thing that I was thinking about while listening to Pam and Kristiana and the little bit of Rasha's that I caught and Jeffreen was how there is this transference of the truth of our experience from life to the page, and that transference isn't it's not very clean, or it's not always very decipherable, but the truth of it is in the page. And I was thinking about this in a character in my book who is really intimately acquainted with shame. And it was actually an interviewer last year who helped me think about this. And I was thinking about how the ways in which I wrote shame for that character came so much from my own experiences growing up as a girl in India. And so much of it was, a very common experience when I was in middle school among me and all of my friends was, being touched and harassed on buses. We would take buses to and from school, and it was really, really common. And the first few times it happened, we were shocked and alarmed, and then we started talking to each other, and then we started sharing, advice on how to speak up, and then we started, raising our voices on the buses and saying, stop that, and what are you doing, and put your hand away, and just kind of attracting attention to it. And that experience, from being a place of great shame and humiliation, it turned into a place where we were able to put that shame back on the people who were doing this, you know, and it was such a, and we even learned to speak about it with humor. You know, we would joke about it with our friends. We would talk about what had happened. And so I think there's something so empowering about turning those elements of identity, those pieces of suffering and confusion and shame, bringing humor to that. And seeing how that energizes our experience of it, and how that allows us a different way of seeing the truth of what has happened. I found that really exhilarating, and I wanted to write that into the book. So that's kind of one way in which the truth of my experience is present in the book, even though I am not really present in the book.
Thank you. Wow, that's so powerful. I just listening to, I'm like sucked into what you're saying, and it's you know, and again, you know, I mean, Jeffrey, you work very closely with writers, but you know, I'm on the consumer end of all of this, right? As a reader, and I thought a lot about those things, right? Like, in fact, like I think the first reader I really, really clung on to when I came to the United States as a college student was Jhumpa Lahiri's books, right? Because even though I'm not an Indian immigrant living in Boston, there was so much there that, you know, to your point, Pam, like writing and so specifically about her experience, like it helped me understand and, you know, kind of process my own experience. So thank you so much for sharing your insights, because I think that really adds richness to our reading, and just it's just amazing. I'm just like so, it's like watching people painting, you know, it's like, whoa, how do you make that happen, you know? And so that's kind of the feelings that I'm having right now as we're so the next question I want to ask, you know, Jeffrey, in a slightly different way, and then ask everybody. So the question is, you know, do you feel that your writing is a political act? And I mean, I think the answer, we may all be able to guess some of your answers, but I really want to know the why, right? Like, why or why not? And and sometimes I run across people who are like, oh, I didn't realize this is what was going to happen when I did this or said this or whatever. And like, have you ever had those moments where you just like wrote a book because it was fun, and then the next thing you know, like it's a political statement, or, you know, I mean, you know, Rasha, you've mentioned it a few times, like it's very intentional for you. So I would love to hear the why behind it. And for Jeffrey, if you could kick us off with, you know, as you work with up and coming writers and people who are really, you know, honing in their art of writing, where it's like for people to think about whether their writing is political or not. And, you know, I mean, I could see as a person of color who's just like, I just want to be like everybody else. Like, I don't want to be the culture, whatever, right? Like, I don't want to be a political statement, but you know, that like being who you are, right? Like, how do people wrestle with that if you see that? And yeah, how do you talk about or support people in thinking through writing as a political act or not? So let's start with Jeffrey, and then we'll have other folks chime in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. You know, I think something that happens with writers of color in particular is, I think there's this trap of being defined by your, which forces your writing to be political in a way that, even if, you know, maybe you don't want it to be. I'm most compelled a lot of times by writing that subverts that a little bit. I think joy is subversive, and I think there's something really powerful and political of just telling a story that is joyful and true for you. You know, a lot of times of needing to like be like a Muslim writer or needing to be an Asian writer. How much of that is because of the white gaze or some kind of label that's being put on you? So, you know, I'm less interested in stories that kind of even unknowingly are responding to like a colonial mindset. And I'm more interested, I think, in stories of that are just true for the community. And I think that in itself is political, being able to express your true self and tell your true story on your own terms. That act of storytelling is the political piece for me, versus kind of the writing itself.
Yes, writing is political. All writing is. If it's not overtly trying to be political, that means its politics are the politics of the dominant parties and of the mainstream. At the same time, I guess like what rubs me the wrong way about this question, not that the way you phrase it, Sung-Yoon, but the way it's often phrased and put to me often by, white cis-het male interviewers, is that I want to turn it around. Why don't writers writing about a all-white women's baking club in Illinois get asked if their writing is a political act, right? That's the problem, I think, with this kind of framing. The idea, again, that like our writing is only political and only looked at it through the lens of colonial politics and through the lens of the gaze of the dominant culture. I think what I really want is for all of us to, again, be liberated to write about only what we feel is true, only what we feel is delightful, selfish, sad, whatever, most intoxicating to us. And, sadness can also be intoxicating. I know we've all like talked about delight and joy, but I just want to, give a shout out to sad literature as well. I think a lot about the way, for example, that our cultural understanding of feminism has evolved through many generations, and I think I want that too for Asian American writing, whatever that is. In that, I feel like when feminism first came about as a movement, there was this pushback, this willful misunderstanding that, right, to be feminist meant you had to be like a bra burning, will never marry a man, will never shave any of my body hair kind of feminist, and that was the only way to be a feminist, and that was feminist writing or a feminist persona. But actually, right, the true goal of feminism, the true goal of any equity movement is freedom for people. So people can choose to be bra burners or they can choose to be housewives, right? And that's what I want for Asian American writing too. Is like people can choose and should be allowed to have platforms to write explicitly about politics, about oppression, etc. But that people also should be able to just as proudly say, I am an Asian American writer, and choose to write about, like, I don't know, making cappuccinos behind a bar at a $7 coffee shop in Brooklyn, right? All of that is Asian American writing, and all of that is political writing.
I really appreciate your framing or your challenge back to the question. And I think that the way I might reframe this, particularly in this space, is recognizing that I choose. By virtue of having been born and arriving in a room, will be politicized. I will be racialized. I will be gendered. And many of those often in assumed ways, non-consentful ways, sometimes very harmful and damaging ways, even in spaces that might wish to offer me care. I feel aware of the way in which, we talked about this in prep for this session, the way my presence here, and I'm delighted to be invited, already disrupts some of the assumptions or frameworks about who is Asian and why is that a meaningful framework in which to organize for community care or for anti-colonial frameworks or for seeking answers to gender-based violence or white supremacist violence. And I think there are historically and in the current moment valuable reasons to invest in some of these groupings and frameworks. If we think about legacies of colonial history and orientalizing of people of all genders in our communities, and if we recognize the way that that's deeply connected to global anti-Blackness, to global anti-indigeneity. And I think I would offer some, refinements with works of the ways, how do we think when I think about what are the aims or the intentions that I make, so I'm going to be politicized. So then what are my options for how I navigate that? How do I respond to it creatively in a way that creates breathing room, life space for myself or for people I want to love? So maybe I think of it less as like selfishness, although maybe sometimes I do create things selfishly, but I think about it as like, who do I want to make a nice meal for? Like, who do I want to love? Maybe sometimes it's me, but sometimes it's other folks. Like, who do I want to nourish or protect? And those choices for me are, yeah, like how do I think about the long history of the 20th anniversary of the War on Terror in a conversation about resisting white supremacist violence against people who are framed as Asian American? How can that become part of our community of care? And how does that become part of our urgency in resisting both interpersonal and state violence? Yeah, I think that these terms are interesting in sort of like who they exclude and who they include, and what are the moments in which we expand the reasons why we frame them, and who else we want to give care to or create solidarity and shared struggle with. Yeah, I think that most of us would like to not be politicized in terms of having our very efforts to survive daily life always be a kind of war. But that is the legacy that many of us have inherited as a result of ongoing colonial, genocidal warfare that hasn't ended. I think the last thing I'll say is just that I really resist in our search for care, I prefer a liberatory framework versus seeking an assimilationist framework. And I think that has me really turning internally to practice greater care for all the members of our community, whether those are folks in our community, disabled folks in our community, trans folks in our community, folks who don't have access. And for me, that's where the political edge or the liberatory edge is, less about like appealing to powerful white dominant institutions for meager rewards, very meager rewards.
I was really struck by what Jeffrey said about joy, and if I can put on my editor hat for a second, I'll just add that, part of what I think can disrupt the politics of a lot of current publishing and a lot of current writing, which is dominated by white writers, is creating room for writers of color and writers of marginalized identities to write about science, tech, geology, food, nature, climate, art, criticism, whatever excites them. And I think opening up that space of joy for such writers is part of what I've been seeking to do in my work as an editor. Allowing that intellectual space, that space of exploration and curiosity, in the same way that, whenever I'm looking for a nonfiction book, recently I thought that I don't know enough about gravity, I should know more about gravity. And so I was looking about nonfiction books about gravity, and they were all by white writers, and I wanted to read something about geology, and again, a lot of white writers. And so those opportunities to do deep research into something you care about, to go out and talk to journalists, be in the field, play, that opportunity for play in literature. I think writers of color don't get those opportunities enough, and that's part of what we can do.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to jump off that and just take a moment to also talk about the craft choices that are political and I think of Julia Otsuka using the first person plural. I think of how much of these hills is gold being historical fiction, but like, whoa, what's happening in that historical fiction? Mega, you're doing this rotating perspective. And so that there are these, and this is what I wish to, maybe number one impart to my students is that, you make these choices on the page that also say something about how you see the world, how you understand time, how you understand community, how you understand you and I. And that matters a lot. And so I also just think taking it to the craft level is so important, and understanding that for the next generation of writers, what are they going to do that just totally throws in the air how I think of how I make story.
Thank you all. Again, such amazing presenters. Really appreciate it. And this will be our closing question. And I wanted to ask you all about just as you think about your journey as writers and how you've come to be, whether it was by choice or happen chance, or the journey that you took, like Kristiana, like moving back intentionally to Hawaii and claiming your identity, and making a decision to write a novel about what's happening. You all had like made these intentional decisions along the way, which it sounds so nice now on the other end of it because you have a book that people can read. And I would love to hear from some words of advice or encouragement, or just provocative thought, even are wanting to write and wanting to do this. And I really am walking away with this new idea that like writing should be selfish. I'm like, oh my God, that's so true, but I've never thought about it that way. So like, what are some like nuggets of wisdom y'all want to draw for any of us on this call or listening in who are wanting to, who are writing, whatever purpose they're writing, generation of writers, not in terms of age, but the next sort of, folks who are up and coming and wanting this art. And maybe there are things, Kristiana, is that you could just throw out here too. But what would you all leave everybody with? Just one, one piece of advice, question to wonder about.
So I would say to find your writing community, whatever that is. The Writers Workshop was founded by 4 friends who were not finding that sense of community in traditional literary circles. And so they, created a community of their own. And it doesn't have to be a formal thing. It can be informal. It could be a group of friends that you trust. And I think that the support and the rising tides lift all ships, right? So if we're all supporting each other, that your writing community is, I think, a big piece of what sustains a lot of people. And it's at the heart of what we do at the workshop in terms of trying to foster and develop that feeling of community for both writers and readers, I should also say. And you don't be part of our community and certainly not writing communities in general.
In and add that I would encourage writers to lean into the complexity of their experiences, the complexity of what they're writing, not feel that they are expected to write a certain way. For instance, I'm working on a travelogue by a writer called Jordan Salama, who's writing about Colombia, but part of what he really writes about is Middle Eastern immigrant communities in Colombia. That's such a significant part of what Colombia is, but it's not what we might think about when we think, oh, a travel book about Colombia. So that is the complexity of his experience, and that is what is exhilarating to me. So even if you feel like you haven't quite seen this story, nobody's really writing about it this way, write about the most complex, truthful things you can.
I would encourage all writers to set an expectation for themselves that the creation process is a sacred, personal, and quiet process, unless you're writing on assignment for a due date. But if you're writing something that comes, that is sacred, and that then you have a decision about whether that's something that is in community but not published, or is published in certain formats for money or not, lineage, tradition. And to really, I would encourage people to separate as much as possible the creation from the business part of it, so that they can feel greater freedom to make choices about how they want to navigate both sides of it. And the last thing I would say to all writers is learn contracts, learn to read rights, read about them, read every contract, and tell publishers that you don't want to sign away all of your adaptation rights, that you away copyright, retain as many rights as you can. That would be my piece of practical advice to writers.
Yeah, and I build off of that. You said the word choice, Rasha, and that resonated with me. That everything is a choice on the page. That can be scary sometimes. Like, oh my gosh, every word I'm putting here is a choice. Is there another word I should be using? But that's also so important, that everything's a choice. But also, like, there's so much possibility in that you can write another draft of new choices. So I think that, like, that's an area of play, that's an area of revision, that's an area of politics too. What choices are happening on the page that are, what is this, holding up? What is this supporting or not supporting? So I think just really understanding, what you're in charge of in your own narrative is really important. And maybe that also goes to those rights. You're in charge of them, so think about them. I'm glad you brought that up.
I would say don't wait for permission from anyone but yourself. I mean, plus one to everything everyone said. Absolutely, community is so important, but I think that often, if you're a member of a marginalized community and a writer, you might spend a lot of your early career waiting for someone to tell you you're good enough, waiting for someone to tell you that's okay, and you're just less likely, frankly, to get that kind of approval from the dominant culture than someone who is not marginalized. And I think if you need to be bold, you need to take your writing at the beginning more seriously than anyone takes it. Perhaps. I mean, if you have mentors, if you have community, if you have family, that's amazing and incredible, but not everyone does, especially at the outset. And just, if you are truly going to write something breathtaking, something revolutionary, something that's never been seen, if you're going to write the first travelogue of Middle Eastern immigrants in Colombia, if you're going to write like the first novel about like Chinese food and Chinese immigrants in Peru, just out there, I want to read that novel. It's not going to look like other things, and so institutions might have a hard time seeing that, because they're businesses. They're looking for something that's replicable and that is, comparable to something that's sold before. But maybe that's not what you're writing. Maybe you're writing the revolution. So give yourself permission to do that.
Love it, y'all. This is great. Such amazing advice. Well, thank you so much for spending, I guess, morning for you, still midday for you, Kristiana, today. I really appreciate it. And for all of you listening, follow us on and Instagram at NAPAW, in the loop about the next conversation series. Once again, Rasha, Pam, Jafreen, Kristiana, Mega, time today, and have a good afternoon.